Because I believe in the protection of individuals and the rights and qualities associated with being such, I negate the resolution. Instead, I maintain that when in conflict, a community's moral standards should be valued above an individual's freedom of speech. Now, to prove this, let's bring to light some of the terms that my opponent defined in her last case. Specifically, first, the definition of a conflict, which broken down to one word can simply be synonymous with the word incompatible. Now, what that means is that when two items are in conflict, if they are incompatible, you can only choose one or the other. You cannot choose both. And this is the type of situation we'll be looking at throughout this round. In order to compare each of our values to see which best measures the resolution, I present a super value, the protection of the individual. And I believe that my opponent should agree with this super value since her goal is to achieve and to prove that the individual's freedom of speech ought to be valued higher. In fact, this goes quite well along with my own opponent's value of human rights. Now, the negative value for this round is the opposite of freedom. And no, I am not speaking of oppression. I am speaking of liberty, which is freedom without the harm of another, i.e. freedom limited by community moral standards. As defined by Black's Law Dictionary, liberty is the freedom that is enjoyed by members of a society that restrains its people as far as is necessary to maintain the general welfare of everyone. Liberty is different than freedom. For example, in situations of injustice and inhumanity, freeing a victim would simultaneously take away the freedom of the oppressor to afflict other human beings. You see, pure absolute freedom by itself destroys itself. In contrast, liberty is self-sustaining because it does not restrict itself, which is expressed and clarified in my value link or my reason to prefer. That liberty is non-restrictive and self-sustaining. Non-restrictive and self-sustaining. What liberty does is it provides a different outlet or a means to exercise those rights without simultaneously destroying or restricting another person's same rights. In essence, liberty is freedom without taking away another person's freedom. An application to illustrate this is that of Inside Voices. Library or study center policies often restrict one's right to volume. Taking your noise and disturbance outdoors is out of consideration for other people around you. So liberty is freedom with guidelines and parameters. The way liberty is limited is through the norms and standards of a community, which brings me to my criterion, conformity to moral community standards. Now, as we've already looked at the definitions, I'd like to present my one and only contention that freedom of speech can cause harm to individuals, that freedom of speech can harm individuals. Now, as we look at my opponent's case that she presented in the very first speech, I have a few points or responses. First, through resolutional analysis of American freedom of speech, the way that America views freedom of speech as defined in the Constitution. And as my opponent admitted in cross-sex, the Constitution itself is a community moral standard. So what my opponent is valuing, the way we will look through, the lens through which we will look at freedom of speech is through the lens of a community moral standard, which is what the negative side is striving to achieve. That we need the lens of a community moral standard in order to best achieve freedom of speech. And second, looking at my opponent's second contention that freedom of speech upholds human rights, my response, I have two. First off, it depends on how it's used. You see, my opponent's contention shows that freedom of speech can have impact, but that impact can be bad depending on how you use it. However, we know that we can prevent freedom of speech from having a bad impact if we can limit that through community moral standards. My second response to her second contention is that freedom of speech minus limits equals harm to human rights. That without the limits of the community moral standards, by holding freedom of speech, we are not obtaining my opponent's own value. That we need community moral standards in order to make sure that we are not harming other individuals or their human rights. And in response to my opponent's third contention, that community moral standards harm human rights because they suppress freedom of speech, I have two responses. First, that there's no warrant that community moral standards will suppress freedom of speech. As she stated in her own case, we are going to be looking specifically at America and the community moral standards that America has provided. And I do not believe that the Constitution and several other laws that are out there are providing a restriction on freedom of speech, but instead we need those to make sure that we are protecting people's liberties, rights, and freedom of speech. My second response to her third contention is that the negative does not have to prove that community moral standards do not cause harm, because just as speech can be used for harm, so can community standards be caused for harm. All I have to do is show you that there is a situation or conflict where freedom of speech should not be valued highest, because if that is the case, then the resolution is proved false. And for all these reasons, I sincerely urge a negative ballot, and I now stand open for questions. Negative speech, I'll be addressing some of the main points that my opponent has pulled through, and then giving you some reasons why I still believe that the negative side is warranted in today's round. Now, first off, my opponent made the point very clear at the very beginning of her speech that because the Founding Fathers created the Constitution with words, therefore, freedom of speech should be valued higher. But I have two responses. First off, that this is irrelevant. The fact that freedom of speech seems to have come first does not prove that freedom of speech should be valued when the two values are in conflict. This does not mean that it is valued higher. Second, the Founding Fathers used words to create the Constitution before there was even a country, before there was even a community to have a community moral standards. Today, it is very different than back then when they were forming the country and providing the guidelines for the country that we use today. Now we have a community to share those values and to abide by them. It is a community moral standard now, but back in the day, there was no community to exist to begin with. My opponent is inherently valuing community moral standards because she realizes we need to have limits in order to make sure that freedom of speech doesn't cause harm. Community moral standards need to come first, and whether my opponent may realize it or not, that is inherent within freedom of speech in the way that we see it today. Concerning my super value and my value and my right value link, my opponent made one big broad response that human rights subsumes. Now, while it may be true my super value correlates very well with my opponent's value of human rights, that they relate very much, my value of liberty is distinct. Now, the main reasons why I struggle with the negative side is warranted in this round is this. First, that the negative does not need to prove that all community moral standards in the world are always good. Because it is true that there are some community moral standards out there that are harmful. However, as I just stated, we are looking at first moral community standards, and we are looking at America. And within those realms, community moral standards needs to be valued higher in order to make sure that freedom of speech is protecting human rights and the individual, which is my super value for today's round. The second and third reason for why I believe the negative side is warranted in today's round correlate. First off is that without limits, without community moral standards, freedom of speech harms. While it may be true that some situations community moral standards can cause harm outside of the United States, no matter where freedom of speech is, if we do not have some limit on it, it can cause harm, and that is always true. My third reason why I believe that the negative side is warranted is that with limits, with community moral standards, freedom of speech can cause benefit and protection to human rights and to the individual. That freedom of speech needs limits. So yes, community moral standards can be awful, but freedom of speech can be awful too. The negative side does not have to justify every silly and ridiculous community moral standard that exists, like you can't eat peanuts in church, for example. I simply have to demonstrate that some community standards in some scenarios ought to be valued above freedom of speech, as I have shown with moral community standards. Because if there is even a single conflict where freedom of speech should not be valued higher, then the resolution is proven false. So the question of superiority is closed. That's automatic, that moral community standards take precedence over freedom of speech. It's clear that that's already a done deal. You see, in conclusion, because sheer freedom of speech can cause harm and destruction, and because liberty is the best way to protect the individual and their human rights through the conformity of community moral standards, I sincerely urge a negative.